welcome to our webinar, How to Choose Amazing Stories for Your MBA Essays. My name is Nelly and I'll be the moderator on behalf of my prep team. I'm here with a very interesting guest, Ellin Lolis, who is one of the world's leading MBA consultants and the founder and president of Ellin Lolis Consulting. I can't wait to hear what she has to share with us today, but before that, to everyone who is listening, you can ask questions anytime during the webinar using the Q&A box, and we'll take time to answer at the end of the session. All questions are welcome, so don't hesitate. I think everything is set now, so I'm giving the word to you, Ellin.
Thanks so much. So thanks for having me. As she mentioned, my name's Ellin. I run Ellin Lolis Consulting, as she mentioned. And we are an MBA consulting firm that specializes in very much helping clients tell their story in a very unique and individual way. We work with a small group of people because that's what we're really passionate about. And we work with people all over the world for all different kinds of schools. So my goal today is no matter where you're coming from, no matter which MBA program you're applying for, no matter what kind of background you have, to give you some tips that can be really helpful to make sure that your essays and stories are as strong as possible. Also, please feel free to write anything in the Q&A box. We'll answer those at the end, as she mentioned. And really no questions too small. So if you have any doubts at all, feel free to send those during any time in the webinar. So I will start okay, awesome. So the first thing that I really want to focus on is when you're thinking about MBA essays, you really want to think in terms of stories. So a lot of people go into their essays and they start writing, and it's kind of, stream of consciousness, and they just, write whatever comes to mind. And even though that can be a great kind of brainstorm activity, in general, that doesn't lead to good essays. A lot of times what we see with applicants that we work with at the very beginning, who don't start the whole process with us, of course, is that they have kind of a general retelling of their CV in their essays, especially if you're applying to schools like Harvard, whose question is, what else do you want us to know about you? Or even essays that ask you about your goals. Sometimes it can just be kind of a recap or a list of everything that you've done. So that's a bit of a mistake. And that's for a couple of different reasons. When the MBA, when the admissions committees are looking at potential candidates who they want to accept, of course, they're looking at your statistics. What is your GMAT score? Where did you go to university? What are your grades like? What kind of companies have you worked for? Have you progressed within your career? Those are all really important. But there are way more qualified candidates than there are spaces in the MBA program. And that's where your personal story comes into play. So they want to see, of course, what makes you you, what makes you unique, what makes you interesting, but they also want to hear as well about your professional achievements. What are some of your wins? What are some of the moments that you're proudest of? So that's where it becomes very important to start to think about how to tell your story and how to put it all together. So one important thing about stories as well is that they're incredibly memorable. So when we're thinking about how to present information in the best possible way, stories are really the perfect thing, the perfect technology, I guess you could say, to tell stories. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, our brains are uniquely wired from a psychological and neurological perspective to respond to stories. That's one of the reasons why, we all love to watch Netflix after work, why when you're making a new friend, you tell different stories about your life. So stories are great ways to communicate information. And because of that, stories are also much more memorable. So if you tell me a story about a project that you worked on, I'm going to remember it a lot more than if you just tell me, I did this, I did that, I did this, and I got these results. So it's very, very important to think in story format. Of course, there are some exceptions where you won't use a story for an MBA essay. Some that come to mind are, Michigan Ross, for example, has a very short essay, 50 words about your goal, and then 100 words about why you need an MBA. You don't have time for a story there. You need to get right to the information. INSEAD as well, they have a 100-word essay about what are your short-term goals. So there, we're not going to use a story, but pretty much everywhere else, we're going to want to use a story. So if that is a goals essay, for example, Wharton, that gives you 500 words, of course, you want to talk about what your goals are and why and how Wharton can help you reach those goals. But you have a good amount of space at the beginning to tell at least one or maybe two stories about your life, about your background, about your experience, that lead into your goals. So that's something that whenever you're writing any essay, the first thing you want to always think about are, what are my stories? What are the blocks of information that I can share? So a lot of people start to struggle a little bit with that. So, okay, I know I need to tell stories, and I know that I need to pick different things from my background to share, but what exactly are they looking for? How do I choose good stories? So I think the first thing that we want to think about is, a story is a single past experience. It could be an ongoing experience, but we'll talk a little bit about in a second about why that might not work quite as well. So a story is essentially a snapshot of your life or career. So when we're telling a story, we tend to use the STAR format. So that's STAR: situation, task, action, result. That's a great framework for telling stories because it gives us structure, and it also gives us exactly the kind of information that we need. Stories that are told in this way are just a lot more comprehensive and a lot easier for us to remember and also to follow along with. Because of that, the result aspect, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, you probably want to choose stories that have a completion. So you can, in certain cases, if one of your most important things is ongoing, maybe you haven't finished the project, maybe you haven't delivered the results yet, you can make it work. But in general, the best story has a result. So in the end, I was able to deliver this project, save our client, $20 million, and be praised by senior leadership, which led to my promotion. So it's good to have an ending, right? We like to watch movies that have an ending. We like to read books that have an ending. So every good story has an ending. If you find yourself in a position, however, where you don't quite have that ending yet, you can talk about what the projected outcomes will be, but in general, try to think about a past experience. So thinking about stories, what makes a good story? There's kind of three keywords that we want to keep in mind. First, we want to think about the challenge. Second, we want to think about the action. And third, we want to think about the lesson. So this is another way to kind of frame the STAR, the STAR format. So if we were going to translate this to STAR, keyword one, challenge, that's kind of the situation and the task. So when we're looking at stories, we always need to think about, what were you doing? What kind of challenge were you facing? What was the situation that was happening that led to this story? Context is really important. So if you just lead into a story and say, I led a team of 5 and we delivered $20 million in results, that doesn't give me a lot of information. I don't really understand what you were doing or why or how important this was. So giving context is really critical, both to understand the example, but also to show you off, because the more we position the challenge, the better you look. So when we're thinking about good stories, we want to think about stories that have a clear challenge. And that can be something that maybe at the time you didn't have the challenge. It wasn't super crystal clear, but looking back, you can say, okay, this is what we were challenged with. So looking at potentially a project, maybe you work in nonprofits and you needed to fundraise, $50 million for your organization in the next 6 months, and you didn't understand or didn't have a clear idea of how you were going to do that, because maybe the organization had never fundraised that much before. Or maybe your boss left on vacation and you had to take over an entire project right before a deadline and you'd never had the chance to lead before. Or maybe you're a management consultant and you go to work on an engagement and the client does not want you there. They do not want to help. So a good way to think about a story is that it always starts with some kind of challenge. This is really important because it gives us clear insight later into how the actions that you took helped you overcome some sort of difficulty, and it makes those actions more impressive. So if you say, yeah, I led a team, we got these results and it was great. Okay, cool. I'm glad you led a team, but this client didn't want us there and our team started to get demotivated. And so I had to, to band together and motivate them and do this and that. And in the end, that's going to look a lot better, right? It's going to show us that the the situation was much more demanding, so the actions that you took were much more impressive. A lot of people too like to kind of shy away from this. If there's some sort of issue or problem or difficulty, they think it's going to make them maybe look bad. And that's not the case. If it's, of course, it depends on how you position it and what kind of example you choose. And we'll talk about that in a second, but you always want to present, here's what I was faced with. And that can be, very often, maybe the partners didn't like your idea for a project, or maybe you were advocating to revamp your company's recruitment process to be more inclusive, and senior leadership didn't like the idea, or you couldn't get funding, or whatever it is for that issue. A lot of people say, well, but isn't it bad to talk about a problem, or is it going to make my company look bad? And of course, we're never trashing anyone when we talk about the challenge, but saying, they didn't like it, or the client didn't want us there, or we didn't know how we were going to make this happen. That's something that's really, really important to mention. So when you mention the challenge, be clear. Give us enough context to understand the situation, what you needed to do, what the challenge was, but also be careful not to drown us in details. So you want to make sure that everything that you present about that situation or about that context is directly related to the example, to the action that you are going to take, and ultimately to the results. So especially with people who tend to work in more technical industries, they like to give us a lot of context, or sometimes, there are multiple work streams happening at once. And so, this was happening and that was happening and this was happening, and we were facing all of these challenges at once, but only one of those challenges is really specific to the example. So also make sure that you focus. Everything that you mention in the context needs to be directly related to the action and what you want me to learn from the experience that you're presenting. Good examples also have clear actions. So if we think about action, we want to have clear steps that you took to make something happen. So there can be tons of different ways to show action. And this is great because this is where you get to show all of these unique characteristics, skills, and really what makes you unique as an applicant. So this can demonstrate leadership. You are facing a leadership challenge and you took control of the team and help them regain motivation, or you coached them to understand what they needed to understand, or maybe you were facing this funding challenge and you reached out to your network and were able to fundraise a unique amount. Whatever that action is, make sure that it's directly related to the challenge. Again, don't give us a bunch of different things that you did if they don't directly solve the problem and directly lead to the result that you're presenting, especially because most stories are going to be a bit on the shorter side. And also make sure that when you talk about the action, that it's clear what role you played in the action. So a lot of times people say, oh, I was part of a team, and so we did this, we did that, we did this. And it's great. Of course, you don't want to take credit for other people's work. You don't want to take credit for and say, you did everything, or, discount the fact that there was a team involved. But we do want to see your role in it. So, my team and I needed to do this. And so I organized this, or I took the initiative and led this. And then together we delivered this. And in the end, I was proud because, so we definitely want to make sure that you're the protagonist of your example. So even if it was a team thing or a company thing, make sure that your role within that is clear. Kind of an aside to that, if you're dealing with an example where it's a failure, where it's a setback, some examples like INSEAD, for example, asks you to talk about a failure that you were a part of. Do make sure that the failure, when you talk about the action, is your responsibility. Don't say, oh, COVID happened, and so my company had to lay off a bunch of people, so the project didn't happen. Well, that's not really your failure. That's not really your fault. So you want to make sure that, when you talk about those actions, that it's directly related to you as an applicant. Finally, we want to talk about the lesson. So when we think about the lesson, this is a great way to wrap up the example, show that you got great results, and also show us what you learned or why this is important, what we learn about you as an applicant. So breaking that down a little bit more. When it comes to the MBA application, one of the keywords is quantifiable outcomes. Whether that's on your CV, in your essays, in your letters of recommendation, we're always looking to see specifics about what kind of results did you generate? What did this lead to in real terms, quantifiable terms? And that's because a lot of applicants come from similar industries. So how am I going to compare the work that you've done with the work that someone else has done? Or what kind of impact did you generate? Why is this important? Why is this relevant? So it's always important to give quantifiable outcomes whenever possible. So in your lesson of your stories, you want to always be very clear. So we were able to deliver the project 6 months early, or we landed a new client, or we were able to increase membership by 15%. Or, we were able to create the university's first policy on this topic. It has to be very, very clear. And if you work in an industry where quantifiable outcomes are a little difficult, you can still think about having a very clear, I guess, kind of quantifiable lesson. So maybe you work in marketing and you can't say, the campaign that I, led to these exact results, or, I don't work in an industry where A always equals B, but you can tell us a little bit more about, was the initiative maybe rolled out to other countries, or was it praised, or did it help generate some kind of result? So always think about some way to show why this work mattered. The counterpart to that is, what did you learn and why are we learning this about you? So the lesson can be a great way to crystallize the example and summarize it into something that says, okay, here's what you need to know about me. Here's why I told you this example. So maybe it's to demonstrate what you learned as a leader, or how it made you somebody who's more aware of the importance of communicating in high stress situations. Or maybe it was the first time that you were a global leader and it made you realize that this is what you want to do with the rest of your life. So whatever it is, you want to make sure that the lesson for you and why this is relevant to you as an applicant is clear. So thinking about, okay, here's what good stories include. Let's now move on to the best stories. So, okay, I've got this list of stories. Now, how do I choose which stories I want to focus on? So there's a couple of different guidelines that we want to think about when we're thinking about the best stories that you want to choose. So the first thing that we want to think about is that the best stories can feature either a personal or a professional challenge. It's going to depend a little bit on the essay. It's going to depend a little bit on what else is included in your application. If they specifically ask you for a professional experience, then obviously use that. Same thing if it's a personal experience. But most of the time, the schools are not that specific. They say, what are your goals, or what can you bring to the community, or who are you, or what else do you want us to know, or what matters most to you? So the questions tend to be very open-ended. So usually what we suggest is to have a good mix of personal and professional throughout your application. So that might be things from your extracurricular experiences. That might be, volunteer projects that you've worked on, initiatives within the office, or of course, professional challenges that you've faced. You want to think about, of course, ideally you'd align with your recommenders, understand more or less what they're going to highlight, what projects, what characteristics, and then think about where else in your essays you're talking about certain stories to make sure that there's a balance. Maybe you're saying, I don't really do any volunteer work. I'm not really involved in any organizations. You can still bring personal stories. Maybe it was you work in healthcare and you had a health crisis when you were younger. And that's one of the main reasons that you got into healthcare. Maybe there was an ecological disaster in your hometown when you were a kid, and that's why you're so passionate about sustainability and ESG. Personal stories don't necessarily have to be volunteer work, but it is nice to learn more about you as a person and really make the application come alive. Good stories also reveal motivations for your current professional trajectory. So when we're looking at your application, and especially with these schools that have shorter applications, Michigan Ross, MIT, we want to make sure that at least some of the stories that you choose give us insight into where you're going in your career. Ultimately, the MBA is a professional degree. People are using it to advance their careers, change their careers. It's not something that people are doing to, do additional research on what leadership means or contribute to behavioral economics research or anything like that. It's a very practical degree that's designed to help you in your career. So the motivations for your current professional trajectory and all of the things that kind of shape that idea are relevant to your application. So when you're thinking about what story should I include, you want to make sure that at least somewhere stories that are relevant to your professional journey are included. Most of the time, those take place in goals essays. So looking at, here's an example or two that led to my, short-term and long-term goals, and here's how the school is going to help me. That's a really common place for us to see professional stories. But if the structure is not quite as explicit, or you maybe don't have an essay like that, still include at least one of your best professional stories that's related. So for example, maybe you're a consultant, you've worked on tons of different projects, but your whole plan is to focus on financial services or private equity. And let's say you're applying to Michigan Ross and they have those 2 short essays. I know I keep mentioning it, but it's a great example for when we're short on space and not a lot of detail in terms of what to include. So they have those 2 examples, those 2 short essays, and then a very short goals essay where we can't bring in a professional example. So for at least one of those short essays, you want to make sure to include a project that's related to financial services. Even if the project that you like the most is maybe in operations or transformation or something like that, you want to make sure to include an example that's relevant to the goals that you're presenting and the direction that you're presenting going forward. The other thing that we want to think about is how that good stories will reveal your unique skills or knowledge or maybe how you gained these skills or knowledge. So maybe, for example, one of your best skills is communication. You're a great communicator, you're a great negotiator. So a good story could show that off. Maybe you have had a lot of leadership experience and showing how you built that leadership or showing off that you're a great leader. Maybe you have great problem solving skills. Maybe you have really made advances in sustainable finance. The best stories are going to show off what makes you a great candidate, show off what makes you unique, and what makes you somebody that would be a great person to have in the class. So we don't want to just choose stories. This story works, or my friend said that this would be a good story. Really think about what they're learning about you and what it's revealing about you. Then, of course, thinking about how you made an impact on others within your company, industry, or even community. We could add community here, depending on the type of story that you're bringing. Good stories, again, have an ending, have a result, and ideally they have some kind of impact that you've made that's greater than yourself. So that can be generating, financial returns for your company, improving processes, improving efficiency, increasing sales, increasing the number of members that are involved in your organization. There's a lot of different ways that we can think about this, but good stories are going to show that you're somebody who gets things done and you're somebody who makes a big impact. So if we have 2 applicants and one says, I led this project and in the end, it was, we delivered it and it was successful. Or, in the end, I delivered this project, it saved this client this much, and senior leadership liked it so much that they rolled it out to 12 other countries where it's generated an additional XYZ in returns. We're going to probably be a little bit more drawn to the second applicant and say, wow, that's a little more impressive than the other one. So again, that's why showing that impact is so important, because it makes us sit up and say, wow, look at what this person's done, and look at the legacy and the impact that they've left. They've only got 5 years of work experience. Imagine 10 years from now what this person's going to be doing, or imagine, with a Wharton MBA, what this person's going to be doing. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you demonstrate a clear impact on others or within your company. That can also be within your community. Maybe you're somebody who focuses on social impact. Maybe you work in nonprofit, maybe you work in government. Showing how your actions lead to direct results in your community is also really important. I created the first, we had a client several years ago who created the first LGBTQ group within his company, a huge company. And within 6 months, they'd had over 1,000 members. Other offices around the world were following suit and creating their own. And all of a sudden he was going around and sharing the information and helping them set up their own groups. That's an amazing legacy that he created within his community. So just mentioning, oh, I created the first LGBT group. Awesome. Already a great thing to do. And we had all of these members join. We were able to open this in other places. I spearheaded that. That's a lot more impressive in terms of being able to make us sit up and say, now, who is this? It's also memorable, right? We think about, remember that guy who created all of those LGBTQ affinity groups around the world? That was so interesting. And ultimately, that's what we're going for as well, is impressing them, but also being remembered. They're reading thousands of applications. So, often dozens per day. So if you're the person we remember at the end of the week, that's a good thing. Also, we want to make sure that the stories that you bring are consistent with your personal brand. So if you haven't necessarily given a lot of thought to your personal brand, I'm going to just go into that briefly here so you can have a better idea of what that means and how to make that work for your application. So personal brand, I think, is a term that gets thrown out a lot, right? Oh, you need a personal brand, personal brand. It's almost become a buzzword, but it is really important. And for me, what it means is I've sat down and thoughtfully reflected on what makes me marketable, I guess, to the admissions committee. I know some people feel a little uncomfortable with the idea of marketing themselves, but if you think of yourself as a product, what do you bring to the table? What product would you be? That's a really helpful way to think about MBA admissions because we're looking to develop a very diverse class composition. So we want to think about, okay, we want some people who are focused on this and focused on that and focused on this. But if you're coming in saying, I'm a little bit of everything, it's kind of hard to figure out where you fit in and how that's going to build my class composition. It can also more often than not just be really confusing. So think about, okay, what is my focus? Are you somebody who is dedicated to using technology to bring better healthcare services to rural communities? Focus on that. My personal brand is that. Are you somebody who is, I'm an older applicant who is finally following my dreams to launch the startup that I've always wanted to create? Focus on that. Innovation, startup, I'm an older applicant and I'm, chasing my dream. Maybe you are focused on working in an NGO and expanding that to increase access to multiple countries. So maybe you're the social impact person. So really think about, how would you describe yourself in a sentence? What do you bring to the table? Make that very clear and make that a hallmark of every aspect of your application. Sit down with your recommender, say, hey, here's how I'm positioning myself. Think about your CV. What bullets are you including? What order are those bullet points in? Which ones do you maybe have to leave out if you run out of space? Your essays, are you making sure that that brand is very, very clear? In your interviews, are you going to, follow up and continue to reinforce that brand? So really sit down, and we actually have a couple of exercises as well that will be made available to you, and that's on our website as well, to think about how to create your personal brand. So step by step, here's how it works, because it can be a little bit of a daunting task at times. So then thinking, once you've chosen your stories or brainstormed some of your stories, make sure that those are consistent with your personal brand. That does not mean, on the other hand, that if it's not, okay, my brand is healthcare, does that mean that I can't talk about anything else in my life that's not healthcare related? No, of course not. You want to show that you have a diverse profile, but you don't want to then say, okay, healthcare, but I also worked a little bit with agriculture, but, I'm also interested in consumer goods. And, sometimes I've done some side projects with fashion. That starts to get a little confusing, and we can't really understand your motivations, why your goals make sense, but also what you bring to the table and what you do to add value to the class. So maybe, for example, you work with ag tech or you're in agriculture. Awesome. Focus on that, share your stories. But maybe you're also involved in a community project to provide education to rural communities. Or maybe you are focusing on increasing the number of women within the agricultural industry or something like that. Maybe you love to play tennis. There's a lot of different things that you can kind of use, and those are still complementary to your role in ag tech. And, I'm the girl, we had a girl a while, she called herself the ag tech girl. So thinking about her, you could still say you're the ag tech girl, but have those things be complementary. It's when you start to present so many different things that conflict with each other that it becomes problematic. So when you're looking at your stories, filter through for those. Choose the stories that are consistent with your personal brand. And then when you're done with your whole application, you're done with all your essays, go back and think, is this consistent with my personal brand? Does this provide a clear picture of who I am, what my motivations are, what I hope to use the MBA for, what I want to do in the past, and why I'm passionate and motivated to pursue this? If the answer is yes, you did a great job. If the answer is, maybe have someone else read it, maybe go back and see which stories might just not fit, so that it's very clear how to maybe fix those issues before you send in your application. Also, later on when you guys get interviews, think about that as well. When you're preparing your answers, when you're practicing for the interviews, make sure that you choose stories that continue to reinforce that personal brand. Again, you don't need to be one-dimensional, you need to be consistent. So that is a bit on how to choose your best stories. We're going to now go into the Q&A part of the webinar today. So I'll be looking at your questions. But before I get into that, I also just want to leave this up for you guys. And Nellie will be sending out additional information about these. But if you're interested in joining our resource center, this is a place where we've aggregated everything that we have that we think can add value to applicants' journeys. Brainstorming exercises, personal brand exercises, so many sample essays. We've been updating them for years and years and years. So if you're interested in joining, there's a lot of value that you can get from that center. So I think now we'll move into your questions, if that works for you, Nellie.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellin, for sharing your wisdom with us today. Indeed, we have a few questions, and I'm going to jump right in with the first question. Are there any tips you can give that will help my essay stand out among everyone else's? That's a big question.
That's a big question. Definitely. So I think that there are quite a few things that you can do to make your essay stand out. So whenever we're looking at a good essay, we're balancing content and creativity. If you look at just creativity, so a lot of people think, oh, to make my essay stand out, they need to be super different and super creative. Yes, they absolutely do. They also need to be relevant. So I had a client several years ago, I'll never forget this. We were working on the Stanford What Matters Most to You and Why essay. And he came to our brainstorm session and said, I want to talk about pizza. I want to say that what matters most to me is pizza. And I said, okay, tell me more. Not sure I see it yet. And it was really just to be interesting and different. He said, I bet they've never seen someone say pizza before. And I said, maybe not. But how does this tie to your story? You work at PwC, you work in audit, you don't own a pizza company. Your family doesn't own a pizza company. You're not a competitive pizza eater. I don't understand how we can justify that pizza is what matters most to you. And no, but it's interesting and memorable. But we had a long discussion. Eventually, he realized that this might not be the best choice for his application. So when you're thinking about creativity, don't make it irrelevant. Make sure that it works really well. So you want to make sure also that you have the content to back it up. So making your essay stand out is a mix of here's all the super impressive things that I've done, told in a way that is memorable and interesting. So a lot of narrative storytelling can be interesting here. Maybe you talk about you're using basketball maybe as a metaphor for teamwork and talking later about how that relates to the kind of teams that you try to create. So, you get on the court and there's 20 seconds left and maybe you make a huge mistake or you pass the ball and you guys make the winning basket. So these kind of examples that are very narrative can be really, really interesting, really memorable, and then also tying into something very much related, which is your leadership skills, how you build strong teams and how that's gotten results. So that's honestly the best way that you can do that, is to balance those two factors.
So be creative, but also reasonable.
Yeah, be creative, but have a reason to be creative.
That's a great advice. Thank you. Okay, another interesting question. When I write about my accomplishments, it sounds like I'm bragging. Can you give advice how to avoid this? Thank you.
That's also a really good question, and a difficult task for sure. So one of the things that you want to think about is it's all about framing, right? So you don't want to say, I did this and I did that, and I'm so amazing. So you want to talk about, again, that context, that challenge can be a really good way to kind of avoid this. So we're facing this challenge, we gave it everything that we got, we did this, we did that. So that is not just saying, here's all the amazing things I've done, but it contextualizes it in terms of, oh, he was doing all of these things to attack a certain problem or overcome a certain challenge. Also, that last part where you talk about the lesson or the results can be a great way to use very specific language. So sometimes it's just a matter of changing the wording around. So, maybe something that's bragging was, I was the top rated consultant of all time. Okay, yeah, that could sound a little bit like bragging, but saying, I was really proud to have delivered this result for the client and was honored when my senior partner recommended me for the highest rating within the firm. So just changing that language a little bit can show more humility. It can present the I guess, bragging point, which is a good thing, in a way that doesn't come across as bragging. So I think those two things are the best way. Of course, too, if you're not quite sure how to phrase that, you can always get in touch with us. We'd be happy to kind of help you refine the language very specifically, but that's generally the best way to do it.
Thank you very much for answering this question. So far, we have 2 more questions and a lot of time. So guys, don't hesitate. Now it's the time to type in the Q&A box and ask your questions. Okay, the next question. Is it true that optional essays are not in fact optional and I should write them? Otherwise, it doesn't look good for the admission committee.
Let's break that down, I think, into a couple of different types of optional essays, because it's going to depend quite a lot. So if you're writing for Stanford, for example, that's one for me that the optional essays are not really optional. And that's because they say, tell us something about your background and how that's influenced you. And then they also say, share up to 3 times that you've made an impact on your community or your organization. Those are really giving you an opportunity to share additional things about yourself. It's very open-ended. If you read them, they almost sound like essay questions that you maybe don't have to actually write the answer to. So that's something that I would say, definitely write those. When it's framed like that, when you can see that it's very clearly kind of like an essay question, write those. It's really important. Also, Berkeley comes to mind as well, or even Harvard has that kind of question now about, do you want to share anything more about your background or your context? Maybe you grew up in a low-income family. Maybe you grew up in a single-parent family. Maybe you moved around a lot. You're a military kid. That can be relevant information for them to understand what makes you you, all of your unique characteristics. So those are optional as well. Of course, I would say don't add things that are just adding noise to your application. But for example, we had a client who was a first-generation college student, low income, and used those essays, applied to Berkeley and Harvard, and used those optional essays to talk about, the challenges that they overcame and how hard they had to work to obtain scholarships to go to better schools, how they had to work 2 jobs during college to support themselves. And that's really important for us to learn. It gives us a lot of insight into this person, and is a move in a way from the schools to promote greater equity, right? So thinking about, what are your achievements, but recognizing that maybe not everybody started from the same place. Some people had some more advantages than others. So understanding that context can be really, really helpful. We also had a client a while back who worked in Latin America, and they were the first Black person to work within their organization ever within that country. So talking a little bit more about their background was really interesting, growing up in a low-income community, being the only Black student in the classroom, being the only Black applicant in the process, being the only Black consultant within the firm. And then how did they kind of overcome those challenges? And of course, in their essay, then we talked more about how they turned those into great achievements and sharing that success with others. That's a great thing to mention. On the other hand, using that essay to say, I grew up really, really wealthy and had went to private school my whole life. mean, you could add that. I probably wouldn't. I don't think that that's context that needs to be really stated. It's in your essays or it's in your resume, what schools you went to. And, a lot of times that's not necessarily something that we need to know. If it is, you could maybe add that. But if there's some kind of relevant information about your background, that's good to share. That's a great thing to put. Then we also have two other kinds of optional essays. One is if you're a reapplicant. So for reapplicants, some schools have a dedicated essay. If you're a reapplicant, tell us what's changed since last year. If not, they have an optional essay, and that's where you'll want to include your reapplicant information. So what's changed since last year? Maybe you have a higher GMAT score, additional volunteer work, maybe new leadership experiences, greater motivations for attending the school, maybe slightly clearer goals than you had last year. That's a great place to include that information if there's not a dedicated reapplicant essay. Then we get to what I call kind of true optional essays. And these are essays where the language is very clear. Use this space to address problems or things that might not make a lot of sense. So they might say, gaps in your work experience, choice of recommenders, low grades, low GMAT score, or anything else that might just be a little confusing. If that's the case, definitely write that. For example, maybe you can't ask your current boss for a letter because your company doesn't know you're applying, they're not MBA friendly, and you don't want to let them know that you're applying because you might lose your job. Totally reasonable, completely relevant reason. In your optional essay, maybe add a line or two about that. In the resource center that I've posted, we have, I think, 30 or 40 different optional essay examples covering so many different topics. You can see if you're in one of those situations. You've got bad grades from college, probably good to justify or at least talk about, how you've grown since then. That's a good thing to include as well. We've worked with clients who also have long gaps in their work experience. Why did that happen? What were you doing? That's good information to include. If you don't have any of those issues, don't use this essay or don't use the optional essay as an essay. Don't talk about, 10 more reasons why you want to go to Columbia or a story about your volunteer work or recap your CV or, explain all of your awards. That's not what they want. So when they have that very clear language, essentially you can read between the lines, tell us about things that don't make sense or are problems in your application. Really think clearly. And if you don't have any of those issues, do not answer the question. It's going to hurt more than help. When you do answer those questions, if it is your case, be clear, be direct, and keep it short. You might have a more complicated situation, so you might need all of the space, but if you don't, just keep it very short and to the point. So essentially, if it's more open-ended, might seem like an essay, yes. And if it's relevant to you in a case of a background, yes. If it's a problem essay, be very careful, use your best judgment.
Thank you for this very extensive answer. I think we managed to help a lot of people who are
I hope.
wondering about it. Okay, a very interesting question just came in the Q&A box. Would you suggest to mention a story that happened when we were still in the university student club, or we should avoid that since we already have work experience? So we should focus on the story related to our work.
That is a good question. I think in general, it depends on how many years of experience you have is one kind of interesting filter. We worked with a client last year who was 42 years old, applying to the full-time MBA program. Things that happened in high school or in university for him it's a long time ago, right? So probably we're not going to mention it. If you're a more recent graduate and it's relevant, that could be very interesting. If you're looking at your application, say, my best leadership example happened when I was in university as the head of this university club. Great. That could be a great thing to focus on to show some leadership. Or maybe you've only graduated 2 years ago. So, you want to add a couple additional experiences to show what makes you a more attractive applicant. Or maybe a university club was really where this path started. Maybe you got involved in the sustainability club or the green energy club, and that kickstarted your whole foray into a career in sustainability. That can be a great starting point for an essay and then continue to show how you've built upon it. So they can be great things to show early motivation or to complement certain things in your application that within your work experience or other experiences might be, let's say, lacking or light. However, If it's not relevant, I wouldn't mention it. I would mention more recent things, maybe talk about stories more related to your work or experiences in the community that are more recent. So you don't necessarily have to just focus on stories related to work, but maybe you have since, created some other sort of initiative, or you volunteered in something more recently. That could be something that's interesting to consider before a university club if you do have that. But a lot of times we do use university stories, especially to kind of show early motivations for something that you're still pursuing now.
Thank you very much. Okay, one question left. The question is, can you talk about the biggest mistakes you have seen in essays? That's an interesting question.
Oh, we could talk about this for an hour. I have a lot of examples. Let me try to think about some of the biggest ones. The pizza essay that I mentioned, that's definitely one of the biggest mistakes. If he'd gone through with it, that would have been a huge mistake. One of the mistakes I see a lot too is that when people are trying to be creative, sometimes they try to be cute or clever. And it just doesn't read well. So you want to be careful with that. Like, it's good to be creative and tell your story, but if you're trying to be maybe a little bit cutesy is kind of the word for it, that just usually just is a little, maybe I'll use the word cringe. So try to avoid that. It doesn't come up often, but when I do see that, it's oh, wow, don't do that. Also, things that I've seen are ethically questionable things sometimes. So, we've had clients that work in organizations that have gone through some challenges, right? Maybe there was a fraudulent case, or maybe the company, closed down because it was not doing things correctly. Or, we've had clients that have worked for organizations that do complex type of work. So I would say definitely don't share things in your essays that could be considered ethically ambiguous, unless it's a question about a time that you faced an ethical situation and handled it well. I think HEC has that question. So that can be an interesting way to kind of talk about how you navigated that. But questions that are, stories that maybe make it look like you are not ethical, that could also be something that I would avoid for sure. Also, I would say essay, the biggest mistake that I see most commonly though is retelling your CV in essentially narrative format. So I did this, I did that, I did this, I did that, I did this, I did that. That comes up a lot for Harvard, especially, that what else do you want us to know? Sometimes people write an optional essay that just kind of recaps their whole background. We've read your CV, we've read your application form. If you guys have started filling those out already, you know that they're very extensive. They ask for a lot of information about you. And the admissions committee asks it because they want that information. If they didn't want it, they wouldn't ask, because every time they put a question on the application, times 10,000 applications, it adds a lot of work to their plate. So if it's there, it's because they want to see it. So don't retell them your CV in narrative format. Choose stories, make those high impact, maybe bring a theme in to make it all connect well. So that's one of the things I see most common. And then the other thing is really, you're not the protagonist of your stories. That is a huge one as well. We did this, we did that, they did this, they did that. You want to make sure that you're showing off what makes you unique. Your team, your company is not applying for the MBA, you are. And then let's see, is there anything else that comes up a lot? Having incomplete or unclear goals, or goals that are not really very relevant. So you really want to sit down and think about, what are your short-term and long-term goals? A lot of people, some schools don't require this, and that's okay. But for the schools that do, you want to make sure that they're very clear. In the short term, I want to do this job and this type of industry for this reason. And in the long term, I want to do this for this reason. You want to be very clear. If it's ambiguous, it's very difficult for your application to be successful. So that's something that definitely, especially in those goals essays, you want to make sure to be very explicit and make sure that they make sense. Again, maybe you love sports and would love to start a sports management company, but if you've never done anything related to sports, kind of more extensively, maybe you just like to watch ESPN, maybe that's not the best goal to go with. Maybe think a little bit more on that.
Thank you very much. I think this was a great question for closing the webinar because you gave us a short recap of,
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of information and useful advice. Okay, no more question. Thank you very much. If you have any final words, now you have your chance.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone who came today, who watched. And if you're watching this later, thanks for watching. I hope that these tips help you develop essays and stories that really can sell your applications to, or your profiles to the admissions committee. Of course, if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you. And good luck.
Thank you once again, Ellin. For everyone who is listening, we wish you best of luck in your academic journey. Bye-bye.